introduction. What a joy it is to be here with everyone this evening. And what a joy it is to look down the list of participants, because I see former students, former teachers of mine, colleagues and friends. It's sort of like this is your life playing out on this webinar. So thank you all for joining in. It is a real joy to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, of course. And I want to give my thanks to Consul General Omori for the warm welcome, to the Japan Society of Boston for sponsoring this event, and to Yuko Honda for inviting me to be here and for that introduction as well. I am particularly thrilled and honored, though, to be able to discuss Godzilla with my friend, colleague, and eminent film and media scholar, Alex Zoltan. I look forward to learning a lot from Alex and the audience gathered today, and I think this should be fun and informative, as most conversations about Godzilla are. Now, once you pull my string and get me started talking about Godzilla, I can run on quite a long time. But I've promised to keep my comments to 15 short minutes. So I thought what I would do is to begin with a quick overview of the Godzilla franchise, since I expect that this audience is a mix of folks, from those with minimal exposure to and knowledge of Godzilla to some extremely devoted fans who I expect know a great deal more about the series than I do. Then I want to talk a little bit about how Godzilla and the films have changed over time, both in Japan and in the franchise's transition across the Pacific to Hollywood. And finally, I'll leave you with a question that hopefully we can all chew on together in the discussion and Q&A. So if you are not a dedicated Godzilla fan, mention of the King of the Monsters is likely to bring one of three popular perceptions of the franchise to mind. First, you may think of Godzilla's original incarnation back in the 1954 original film, and think of the monster as a cinematic manifestation of nuclear fear, a somber pop culture meditation on Japan's traumas of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, defeat, and Cold War anxiety. Alternately, especially if you're my age, you may recall the Godzilla of the 60s and 70s, and the colorful, lighthearted, goofy movies made for kids, with a famous man in a rubber suit wrestling with yet another man in a rubber suit, likely a giant moth or lobster or robot. Or, especially if you're of a younger generation, you may think of the slick, big budget, heavily marketed, and only tangentially Japanese monster presented by Hollywood, the heavy-set creature unleashed on the world by Legendary Pictures in a blockbuster trilogy between 2014 and 2021. Now, all of these perceptions are completely correct, of course, since Godzilla has adapted, morphed, and transformed over the decades, suggesting the big guy may be less dinosaur and more chameleon. Considering that Godzilla is now almost 70 years old, with 33 live-action movies under his belt, 29 of them made in Japan by the major studio Toho, and 4 in Hollywood, in addition to 3 feature-length anime and a recent animated series on Netflix, it is hardly surprising that the monster has changed over time, reflecting audience preferences, market dynamics, political trends, and cultural shifts. You don't get to be arguably the world's oldest and longest film franchise or become a veritable global pop culture icon lionized on The Simpsons, enshrined in countless memes and New Yorker cartoons, and integrated into the English language through the Zilla suffix, unless you can roll with the punches in a fickle global marketplace for mass entertainment. So going back to 1954, the original movie in the series, the dark, brooding, and absolutely classic Godzilla, was very much a product of its times, made less than a decade after the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender in World War II, at a moment when the post-war economy was just beginning to recover and the world was gripped by Cold War nuclear anxieties. Gojira introduced the basic narrative of a dinosaur rendered monstrous and radioactive by American H-bomb testing in the South Pacific that proceeds to attack Tokyo. The movie was a hit in Japan and was subsequently heavily edited, some would say censored or even whitewashed, with most of its anti-nuclear political message removed for distribution in the United States in 1956 as Godzilla, King of the Monsters. The vengeful, politically charged Godzilla of the 1950s did not last long, however. As the Japanese economy picked up steam and the nation swelled with post-war confidence and optimism, as exemplified by the triumphant spectacle of the 1964 Olympics, audiences were not interested in gloomy musings on the consequences of nuclear testing or scenes of their booming capital city engulfed in flames. At the same time, with the advent of television, Japanese studios struggled to attract adult moviegoers, and children became the most defendable audience in Japanese theaters. The Godzilla franchise was quick to pivot. Although the movies continued to deal with a number of timely social and political issues, from rampant commercialism and political corruption to Japanese remilitarization and the pollution crisis, to, believe it or not, school bullying, Godzilla became a comic, cheerful monster. Godzilla was recast from a villain to a hero, defending Japan against legions of giant, threatening creatures. The tone of the films became lighter and more upbeat, and the monster's appearance was softened and rendered more cute than frightening. Godzilla was, of course, originally inspired by giant monsters from the United States, notably the pioneering 1933 King Kong and the 1953 blockbuster The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. It was only in the 1990s, though, that Godzilla finally made his way to Hollywood. The 1998 TriStar production, marketed under the classy slogan, "Size Does Matter," has been panned by most Godzilla fans, myself included, and perhaps not surprisingly, for a movie featuring an escapee from Jurassic Park and Ferris Bueller, was not a particularly thoughtful or politically engaged entry in the series. That brings us finally, though, to the latest Hollywood offerings, the suite of Godzilla films in the MonsterVerse franchise from Legendary Pictures. The first of the Legendary offerings, Godzilla in 2014, was successful commercially and critically, channeling, in my opinion, the best of the Japanese Godzilla series and the best of early 21st century Hollywood movie making. It had a message, it had a heroic Godzilla, and it spoke to timely issues. Specifically, it addressed the human ordeals of natural disasters like the San Francisco earthquake, Katrina, and the 2011 quake, tsunami, and nuclear accident in Japan. The film did not use a man in a rubber suit to play Godzilla, which I really regret, but it did have great special effects and the kind of pacing and drama that Hollywood does so well in action pictures. Legendary's second movie, Godzilla, King of the Monsters from 2019, was less successful in many respects, notably in its ham-fisted and harebrained attempts to address the threat of climate change, long an issue which I felt Godzilla needed to tangle with. Legendary's third try, the long-anticipated Godzilla versus Kong, was hardly great cinema, but was, I think, a great pandemic picture. While the storyline and the human action were pretty much extraneous, the cathartic joy of seeing a big ape whomping on a big lizard, and both of them then whomping on a big robot, was just what movie audiences needed in the midst of quarantines and lockdowns. So how did the King of the Monsters change in his transition across the Pacific to Hollywood? Now, we could talk about this for the rest of the day, but just briefly, the man in the rubber suit is, alas, no more, replaced by slick CGI at Legendary, and also in his most recent outing from Toho in Japan, the magnificent 2016 Shin Godzilla, which I hope we'll talk about more later. Godzilla was also supersized in his latest American incarnation, growing to unprecedented height as well as belt-popping girth. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, one aspect of the American Godzilla features that has struck and annoyed me is the way in which they all rewrite the origins of Godzilla, deviating from the story established in the Toho franchise to deflect the blame for creating the monster away from the Cold War and, above all, away from US nuclear testing in the South Pacific. So remember, the original story was Godzilla is this dinosaur that has managed to survive from the Jurassic period, swimming around in the waters of the South Pacific. America comes to do H-bomb testing on Bikini Atoll. Blam, Godzilla is rendered radioactive, monstrous, attacks Japan. The rest is history. Fast forward then to 1998, the first Hollywood picture, the TriStar film. Well, if you're not going to pin Godzilla on American H-bomb testing, who are you going to blame? Well, happily, there are always the French. And so in that movie, Godzilla's origins were traced to French nuclear testing in Polynesia, hence the annoying Jean Reno character running around through the entire film. Fast forward yet again to 2014 and the Legendary series. And this is really interesting because they really completely rewrote the origin story of the Godzilla movies to remove any American blame for creating the monster. So in the Godzilla retelling, in the Monsterverse, the Earth is a hollow orb, and inside there are all these monsters. And in the 1950s, the monsters started popping out of the center of the Earth, sort of like popcorn out of a Jiffy Pop, and they started popping out in the South Pacific. The world powers at the time didn't want to scare people by saying they're giant monsters we didn't know about coming out of the Earth's crust. So they addressed this by attacking the monsters with nuclear weaponry and saying this was H-bomb testing. So in this retelling of the story, American nuclear testing in the South Pacific becomes almost humanitarian in its way that it is seeking to save the world from monsters rather than the cause of the scourge that was Godzilla. This picture really says it all from the Legendary films. So to wrap my comments up here, let me just pose that question for discussion that I promised you. Why do you think almost 70 years after the big radioactive Japanese lizard made his debut on the silver screen, why does the world still love Godzilla? And why is the monster seemingly more popular than ever before? Well, if you were to ask me, I would say that on the most basic level, Godzilla is just plain fun. The exuberance, the cheesiness, the cathartic nature of destruction, all are just enjoyable to watch, whether you're 6 years old or 60. Godzilla is the outrageous guy that breaks all the rules and gets away with it, the walking disaster who leaves a trail of destruction behind him and inspires not just fear and loathing, but also admiration, awe, and an odd tingle of delight. But Godzilla also has a serious side. And I think one reason why we continue responding so strongly to him is because he has functioned as a cinematic conscience for viewers in Japan and globally since World War II. Godzilla's very presence, the disruption he causes to the status quo, and the existential threat the monster poses to our lifestyles, our comforts, our assumptions, and our complacency, keeps us asking questions we know we need to keep asking about issues like the environment, war, nuclear energy, arrogance, prosperity, technology, and now, after the pandemic, biosecurity, globalization, and the appropriate reach of governments during moments of crisis. In the end, though, I feel that what makes Godzilla so compelling for so many and so significant, not just for Japanese culture or American culture, but for global culture, goes somehow beyond the monster's longevity, ubiquity, topical relevance, and sentimental appeal. Godzilla distracts us and makes us laugh, as entertainment is meant to do. Godzilla challenges us to think and feel in ways that pop culture so seldom does. And the Godzilla films shine with a profound and genuine optimism that we all need more of at a uniquely complex, unsettled, and anxiety-ridden time. In the Godzilla series, movie after movie, human society endures. Tokyo gets miraculously rebuilt, and the king of the monsters returns once again from the sea. This essential optimism, this faith in progress and in the resilience of human society was important in the 1950s when Godzilla helped Japan and the world recover from the nightmares of the atom bombs, and remains powerful even today in the wake of more recent tragedies to hit Japan and threaten the entire world. On some level, Godzilla is just a man in a rubber suit, but I hope you'll all agree with me that when all is said and done, the king of the monsters is truly so much more. Thank you so much.